Welcome back to Selling Circular, the podcast where we are rethinking status quo capitalism by exploring innovations in the circular economy. This is my best Sabira impression of how to ease into an episode. Today's topic is at the forefront of green energy transition, which is we're talking batteries and we're talking sustainability and circular economy in batteries. I'm Garr, CEO of LoopLayer.
I'm Sabira Lakhani, VP of Product at Reaply, with my podcast voice.
How did I do? I
You did
eased
really
into
well.
it. Okay,
I was
good.
proud of you. If this is your first time joining us on our adventures, we're thrilled to have you here as part of our growing community dedicated to advancing the circular economy. And the best way to help us is to share clips, subscribe, tell your friends and colleagues, listen, comment on our LinkedIn posts,
Comments.
and engage with us. Yeah. As we move towards electrifying everything in the world, from cars to power grids, batteries, we know are crucial to our more efficient future. But this brings challenges and opportunities when you think about the circular economy. How can we ensure that the batteries that are going to power these futures actually decrease in environmental impact and environmental potentially damage? Like, how do we address this carbon intensive production and maximize their lifespan and utility and value?
So to help us really unpack these complex issues, we were joined by a true expert. Grayson Shor brought a wealth of experience in circular economy and battery sustainability, having worked across the federal government and private sector roles. That included serving as a U.S. plastics negotiator to the UN and his current role focusing on circular economy for batteries at Amazon. Grayson really offered more unique insights into the challenges and opportunities in this quickly evolving field where there's new policies, there's new mandates for companies and at the federal level and in the EU. So lots of moving parts to this. I love how we were out of our element with this interview a little bit. Usually we're on it with the waste side and the circular economy side, thinking through. But there's a whole nother level to batteries and to energy storage and recycling and reuse of batteries and the technical aspects of that were just, I feel like we were just almost in awe of like what he was bringing to the table.
Yeah, and actually in a separate conversation, you and I had kind of like tossed around why we don't celebrate the auto industry more in general for their historical circular economy advances and just practices. And it's because of the value of the stuff in the vehicle that they've managed to do that as an industry. And I think it's a very pivotal moment where there's like this new thing inside of the automobiles that we need to like rethink. Oh wait, how are we going to do this?
Great segue too, and bringing that up of in terms of circular economy, I would almost say, we always get regulations are always this, boogeyman of oh, we don't want more regulation in business, but in this case, no, regulations have made and consumer expectations have made cars better and better. And over the years, now you've got cars in which a lot of investment has been made into the core components of vehicles. And because of all the investment in that, if you get that core component back, well, you're actually able to recreate, remanufacture, refurbish those components in ways that are lower carbon and also then get that back out to the consumer. And so you got me going on remanufacturing. And that's I love that track.
Throw back to our Theo episode.
Oh, exactly.
Season 1,
throwback.
Season 2.
Yes, I think it's season 1. Yeah. And so absolutely throwback to Theo. And so ultimately, in order to get that expertise to come talk to us, he came prepared with serious talking points and metrics.
So ready.
Yeah, very ready. And it was awesome because it was so important for us to really understand frankly, the magnitude of this industry. But it's also important for us to note that in order to get his experience on the pod, he asked that we very clearly delineate his views on our podcast coming up from the public opinions expressed by his employer, Amazon. So in no way should anybody be listening and taking his personal reflections as representing the official stance of Amazon. Thank you, listeners, because then that will help him and he will be able to talk more freely too in the future about his personal stance and that of Amazon. Hey, listeners, we're jumping out of the episode into a quick edit, which we've never done before, from the edit bay. Grayson Shor has actually recently been hired at the newly formed New York Climate Exchange, where he is going to continue focusing on leading the exchange's circular economy and battery critical minerals program. So again, we just talked about Amazon, and we will talk about Amazon quite shortly into the interview. But that changed, and he's now doing some great work at the other side of the coast in New York, again, working on the New York Climate Exchange battery program. Wish him the best of luck. We still get to learn lots. Enjoy the episode. Thank you for joining us so early on your Seattle time zone. This is very generous, Grayson. Let's start this off. Let's just rip right into it. Can you describe your role of circular economy and battery sustainability lead at Amazon?
Absolutely. So I'll note, anything I share today is of my personal opinion, separate from Amazon. But with that being said, absolutely. So I've focused my career in a variety of ways, focused within the circular economy, both previously in the civil society, non-governmental organization world, moving into federal government at one point, working with Secretary John Kerry and the SPEC team, and then currently with Amazon and their circular economy team and worldwide operations. And throughout these roles, I've focused a lot of my time on circular economy. And within that, looking at issues like one serving as a U.S. Plastics negotiator to the UN to try to figure out how can we as a global society reduce plastic pollution internationally, and how can we leverage the circular economy to work out waste that's in the plastic supply chain. So how can we reduce plastic getting into waterways and landfills and all that? To what I do today, looking at how can we do that for batteries? How can we better design batteries and better get our critical mineral materials so that when we are moving towards things like electric fleets and Amazon and other companies as well across the globe, how can we ensure that we're reducing the carbon emissions associated with manufacturing those batteries, use them most efficiently and effectively, and most responsibly as well to achieve a variety of sustainability goals?
Love that. Before we get right back into batteries, you do probably have some sort of take on INC5 or any of these plastic negotiations. What's your take? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we going to be, stagnating over time? Like, I mean, where are we headed with this?
I'm optimistic and concerned at the same time. I'm optimistic because with INC5, we saw that there was a lot of countries who were very much in favor of a global binding treaty on plastic pollution and addressing that. And there were just a few of the similar typical players that we see at places like the UN climate conferences that are a bit of a stick in the mud. And I would point to countries like, Saudi Arabia in this particular case for INC5, and there's others that are in the minority now. And so, INC5 did not end in the way that I hoped it would with the globally binding treaty. However, there was a lot of reports and statements and press releases by a handful of countries and trade organizations, and you name it, talking about how, hey, maybe if this INC5 and this system's not going to work out for us, maybe we can explore something else, some other avenue for creating laws, regulations, whatever it might be to address plastic pollution. So I'm hopeful in that sense that it seems like the majority is thinking in the right direction, at least where they should go.
Balanced. I like it. Yes, we're progressing to that progress. What can you take from both now your previous negotiation experience, thinking through multiple different stakeholder priorities, and how are you now applying this in your work and in your personal passion in the battery world? That's where this starts. Now we've got a whole new set of stakeholders with a whole new set of priorities. What are we looking at? How is this actually developing currently? What are we looking towards for the future?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the most exciting things in the circular economy, or actually even the industrial, actually, let me restart that. I would say to me, one of the most exciting things that we're seeing in the renewable energy transition, the green energy transition, is a shift towards electrifying everything. And as we're electrifying everything, we're relying more and more on batteries and stationary storage. That could be batteries in our electric vehicles to batteries that are serving as backup power for pulling in solar and wind and all that to use when it's not windy and it's not sunny outside. And so one of the major things that I think is thankfully being talked about more and more is that these batteries are super carbon intensive to produce. Typically, they're the most carbon intensive component of whatever they're in, a consumer electronic and electric vehicle. And so I think that as we apply a circular economy to try to reduce the emissions, the manufacturing emissions of these batteries, we can apply them in a variety of ways that draw down the overall emissions for these batteries, which then help us as we make this renewable energy transition and really rely on batteries to reduce our overall emissions of this transition. And this can be done in such ways as let's take an end-of-life battery from an electric vehicle, and while it still has juice in it, let's not send it to a shredder and recycle it immediately. Let's reuse first, recycle second, right? So let's figure out a way to remanufacture that. Let's figure out a way to use those batteries to their fullest extent, just as the circular economy principle. Let's keep materials in cycle for as long as possible to get the maximum material benefit from it.
Maybe let's jump into the technical because I love that. For batteries, is there a way today to know how much juice is left in it, like what the condition is, what the usage will look like, and therefore, can you actually remanufacture it if there's been damage? Like, what's the knowledge base around that
and
the actual thing?
And I'll throw in straight reuse too. That I think that's
right.
How do you even know whether something's technically still safe?
Exactly. These are the really hard, tough questions that the entire industry is trying to figure out answers to right now, because this is an emerging issue, an emerging opportunity, I'd say, as well. So this is like my cough wink nod to startups or any type of companies, policymakers, to figure out the answers to these things and build the technologies. I think that it's going to be a multi-billion dollars opportunity to figure this out. I think I'm going to point to two things. One is policy, and the other is insurance. So let me start with the some people may roll their eyes at your insurance. Oh, that's boring. In the case of this, it's incredibly important, right? If you have an electric vehicle and you get in an accident, today, since there's not great widespread or scaled systems of really testing, okay, is the battery in this vehicle safe to continue to use and drive around? Is it going to go through thermal runaway? In other words, is it going to catch on fire and things of that nature? There's not good insurance protocols today. There's not good diagnostic information that will allow for certainty to say, for an insurance company to say, yeah, we'll continue to insure this vehicle and not have a massive liability. So often the vehicle is put in for a total loss, which is really sad, because then that vehicle can be typically sent to a shredder with the battery and all that material. Exactly. All that material is lost, and all the energy that we put into it is kind of wasted to an extent. As we all know, recycling is like a last resort step in the circular economy. And so I think that having more transparency in the data of the battery, that means working with OEMs who currently kind of hide their secret sauce in a battery, and the battery management system, basically the brain of the battery, is hard to access. So working with insurance companies and trying to increase access to this information is really vital to ensure that we can, if you have an EV that's in an accident, run diagnostics and say, okay, this is still good to go. Let's put it back out on the road instead of recycling it. Another portion of this is the policy side, I was mentioning. The EU battery regulation is like chef's kiss. I'm a huge fan of it. It is a first iteration of a law like this, so it's not going to be perfect. It's being figured out, right? But it's like the minimal viable product that's coming out there. And what I love about it the most is that it requires that batteries have a digital product passport associated with it. These are batteries that are 2 kilowatt hours and larger that are being sold or manufactured in the EU market. And why this is great is that it requires manufacturers, sellers to share information about their batteries in the market. And that allows for that problem I was saying about insurance companies, for them to get information about the battery, know where it's coming from, know how it's being operated. There's tons of benefits and economic opportunities that come with this. that are going to really help enable a circular economy for batteries in the EU. And I hope that other countries follow suit with that as well.
How does that affect our country?
Mm.
That EU policy. Where are you seeing that sort of play into the conversation or the potential?
Um, well, I would say that in the EU, the prevalent perspective I see in the circular economy laws is that waste is not it isn't just a failure of material. Well, let me put it this way: waste isn't a failure of materials; it's a failure of imagination, right? And so the perspective of applying more data transparency, providing more access for right to repair, things of this nature that we're seeing in laws coming out of the EU are having impacts in other economies like the US and China and India, countries that do a lot of trade with the EU. In the US, we're seeing some similar laws that to the EU battery regulation start to pop up. California always leading the charge as it pertains to like electric vehicles or vehicles in general and regulations on that front. Has a law I think that they put in last year, a Senate bill that was focused on trying to create more transparency in the battery supply chain
Hmm.
in an efforts to create a circular economy for batteries. So I think that's vital. And I'd also say I've seen a trend increase about talking about extended producer responsibility requirements, first starting with plastics and packaging and things of that nature. But I think that it's starting to expand, thankfully, to critical minerals and batteries.
To the point where, if I read correctly, there was a recent New Jersey EPR
Mhm.
law that was enacted. And I think that was the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Battery Management
Yeah.
Act. And so, like, we're starting to see that be adopted.
Totally, totally. We're starting to see things like this pop up all over the US, all over India,
Okay.
all over South Korea, Japan, China. We're really starting to see a lot of these new laws and regulations in this regard pop up. And I would say that kudos should go to the EU in part for really jumpstarting a lot of this at scale. Not to say that like China actually has had some really impressive regulations dating back years that are really forward thinking to create a circular economy, not just for batteries, but for a variety of materials. So, um, it's not just Europe, it's Asia too that's leading the charge in this.
I think what's so interesting about the digital product passports and the pressure on OEMs to publish them is you could think about what to do with that information in a couple of different models. Like one model is that the OEM remains responsible, like actually responsible,
Yeah.
and does the work to have the information and make the information usable to themselves, or the free market, I'm going to say, and or the free market can leverage that information, try to consume it, keep track of it, and then innovate around it. So providing technologies to figure out if the battery still has juice, or marketplaces to transact on batteries, once you have the information about how much juice is remaining. Do you see any patterns and trends as to which direction it might go? And also, do you have a point of view as to which one's better for the utility of the battery?
That's another great question. To answer it, I want to lay down a couple of facts here, right? So batteries have been increasing. The use or demand for batteries have been increasing around, I think it's 30%, 33% for the past 30 years, year over year, right? And then we're going to see sometime by the mid next decade, about 8 to 11 fold increase in demand for batteries. So batteries are, in short, incredibly important. Um, Electric vehicle batteries, or the battery demand for electric vehicles, is what's driving a majority of this demand, this increased demand in batteries and the critical minerals in them. Um, as far as like juice in the batteries and what remains and things of that nature, today typically an EV battery is considered an end of life when it's at about 70% state of charge. So that means that it's when you're charging, you plug it in, it's only getting to about 70% instead of 100% when you first got the battery, right? And so after that point, typically the batteries, especially as we're seeing in like fleet vehicles and what have you, will be sent for some type of secondary life. That could be secondary life if it's a commercial vehicle sent to a private owner of it that may be okay with the range going from a couple hundred miles to a few dozen miles over a period of time, right? Because you could really stretch out that use of the vehicle. It depends on the user. What are you okay with? What's your range requirements. Are you in a city and you're commuting 10 miles every day and a stated charge of something below 70% is all right? If you are driving that vehicle really hard, like some fleet operators might, then you really need to have that higher stated charge and that resilience and reliance, right? So it depends a bit on the consumer. But let's say you take that battery and you retire it at 70% stated charge, and you use it as a stationary storage at some type of business. Let's say you hook it up to a hospital or something like that. You're going to get about 5 years of additional use out of that battery as a battery energy storage system, and reduce your cost per kilowatt hour compared to using a virgin material by about a third. So yes, the battery is going to not be used as long, but it's great as a backup emergency generator or something for short bursts of power. We're talking like maybe a couple of hours here. So that's a really important thing to know. And we haven't gotten into it yet. I'll turn it back to both of you, but different battery materials and innovations in batteries that are using less critical minerals and things like thermal batteries are really exciting. So we can't not talk about that as well.
Well, I would love your opinion then on how that changes the state of figuring out solutions for particular battery types or particular battery volumes. Because if an industry is trying to focus on, okay, this is a solution set for this type of battery, I find I would be hard pressed to go, oh, we can innovate this direction, and then a whole new technological innovation happens for the actual composition of the battery that might change that equation. Yeah. How much is that a part of your field, or that sort of the thinking of behind battery sustainability and circular economy policy?
So let me answer it this way. So if we continue to make batteries as we did in 2015, nickel and cobalt demand in 2023, so last year, would be 2 times higher than it is today. The cobalt demand would be 2 times higher, and the lithium demand would be like 58% times higher. So this is why the shift, right? Well, it's 2 things. One, it's a primary change in the rapid increase of lithium iron phosphate batteries, LFP batteries, away from nickel manganese cobalt, NMC batteries. And also the average density of batteries has increased by about 25% since 2015. So more energy in a smaller, getting more energy from less materials. And so we're seeing this massive shift happening in the electric vehicle battery industry, again, away from NMC and towards LFP. And that's moving out, really expensive and often kind of potentially scrupulous supply chains associated with cobalt. I mean, we've seen all the reports about unfortunate like child labor and types of practices like that in the DRC. And while that's not in all cobalt supply chains, there's certainly some reports out there publicly that show that can be in the supply chain. So it's a bit concerning. I think that's one major trend to look at. The second is for stationary storage. Yeah, okay, you need a really power dense battery for an electric vehicle, because you don't want to be driving around a battery that's the size of a bus to drive your Fiat 500 or whatever, right? And so this is where different battery chemistries come into play. If you are needing a battery for stationary storage to power like your hospital, we said earlier, your business or whatever, you can have a quite large battery, or to have backup power for a town or a city. It can be quite a large array. And this is where I think thermal batteries really come into play. They are not super, at instances, they cannot be super power dense. They're typically larger arrays, but they can really hold an immense amount of power. They don't rely on critical minerals as much. For example, some thermal batteries are just literally clay cubes that are held in a box, and they're heated by renewable energy, and then they can release steam at certain times when you need that energy, basically a steam generator. And again, they're not relying on materials that require scrupulous mining. I mean, we're talking clay here, right? So I think we have to.
I love your call upon clay. Again, we're almost homage to the first batteries,
right?
Yes.
So,
yeah, I think this is where. So connecting some of those dots, then what I'm hearing is that's the purpose of the digital product passport, to be able to find out exactly what that battery is and then what its set of next life options can be. And if we can start to build that flow of material, or that product, and say, hey, these are the reuse options. well, we probably do need more solutions that are making that very easily able to make that decision at the critical moment of intervention when that product is being transferred from its first use to whatever its next use is going to be. And I think that's where, for anybody thinking about these innovations, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, there's probably some opportunity there to think about those businesses. But for anybody working internally to an organization, being ready to understand what your battery needs might be in order to be able to design a solution around whether you're in a hospital, whether you're in a school, and I bet there's probably a difference there because different energy needs or something to that degree of like what you might be able to design and plan for.
Let me put it this way, and I'm going to pull back to the insurance point that we were saying earlier. So UL 1974 is the prevalent certification for reusing, like we were talking a lot today about electric vehicles, so let's focus on that. Reusing like an electric vehicle battery as some type of secondary use. And so this is like the industry standard for saying, okay, if you are going to do that, you have the certification. An insurance company may be more likely to say, hey, yeah, we're going to still insure your building, even though we have this reused battery next to it. And you don't want to put let's say a $200,000 reused battery next to a $5 million building and risk burning down the building to save, a little bit on the money and the carbon and all that, right? You want some of that certainty and safety. And so, to my knowledge today, there only exists 2 companies in the entire world that have this certification. There's one in Vancouver, Canada, and there's one in Japan as well. And so I'm like ringing the bell here for companies that are remanufacturing batteries to get like certifications like this, because it's going to enable larger companies that are trying to reduce risk because their buildings may be expensive, or it may be, again, like a hospital and you don't want to risk harming people in the hospital through a battery fire. Obviously, having these certifications are really key. So look into that. One other thing, if I may, just to point out, is that the battery industry, as we were talking about earlier in policy, it's kind of like a minimal viable product for the EU battery regulation, and things are rapidly shifting. Well, we have to look at the cost of batteries too, right? And the cost of batteries are precipitously going down and down and down. And this creates a bit of a conundrum similar to what we've seen for plastic circularity. Virgin plastics are cheaper than recycled plastics. Virgin or new batteries today are cheaper than reused batteries. And we have to think about then the role that policy can play in these things, right? Because recycling batteries, recycling plastics, better designing them costs more money today, but it's more socially responsible. It's more environmentally responsible. And these things in our current economy measured by GDP don't put so much of a value on a social good, right? Or reduction of carbon in the atmosphere. It's a lot of like bottom line, how much money we make in this and that. And so I think that as a society, as we're moving from a linear to a circular economy, we need to think more about the systems and the incentives that we're placing on shifting to these materials. And I think as we create more policy in the US and the EU and Asia and elsewhere, that enables the economic incentives that can push companies, organizations, whatever it is, to prioritize the reuse, the circularity side of things is going to be absolutely vital. But it's we got to do the policy. We got to do the policy with it. Otherwise, I'm not sure that we would see as much of a scaled change in these ways as I would like.
I'm jumping in here, Sabira, just for exclamation. You can ask your next question. This is my favorite part about circular economy is the economics and market competition when you're trying to make these end of life decisions that are literally all based on actually procurement decisions in the first place. And so it's this really complicated decision making set that just starts with the original pricing, the market trend, and I love that quite dynamic, more complicated relationship. It's fascinating.
Here.
Well, I think it leads to a good question, which is like, is anybody doing it well? Like, is anybody helping close the loop either by partnering with other service providers or OEMs offering kind of take back, or is there any model that's like, oh, that looks like that could be a good good what direction for us to follow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's great examples in like Philips, for example, that's using product as a service. They're selling, I forget the name of the airport, but it's one in Europe, and they're selling not their light bulbs, but they're selling the lighting. And so the lighting is rented by the airport, and Philips will have more of an incentive to not have a planned obsolescence of their light bulbs, but ensure that the light bulbs last for as long as possible and sell that light. There's great examples too of Patagonia. I think it's like worn wear or something like that, where similar to what we'd say about Apple, you have an end of life product, you can bring it back and you get some type of incentive, or you get a like a gift card or whatever it might be, some cash to do that. And there's really like countless examples here in the EV or the car market. Renault is doing a massive amount of investment and remanufacturing and parts harvesting from their vehicles. So great places to find examples, of course, are on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website. Closed Loop Partners is another great example here in the US, based in New York. They do a lot of investing into circular economy companies. And so if you go and look at their like portfolio, you're going to see tons of great companies and startups that are advancing a circular economy. So those are two great areas to find some examples that come initially to mind.
Well, of course, it's the Amsterdam airport, I believe,
Yes.
maybe what you're referencing.
That might be it.
I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but the Schiphol
You're you're brave, you're braver
airport.
than I am, because it was also in my mind. I was like, I'm gonna
Yeah,
butcher this too. So
yeah. Well, on that, I mean, thank you for naming, I mean, some of those great organizations that are leading the charge. Again, I hear a lot more research, a lot more investment needs
oh,
to be
totally.
done. I mean, I think, I don't, I can't name a couple battery. For some reason, Redwood is in my
Hmm.
head on a
Yep.
battery recycling company. That again, you're starting to see more of these that are starting to pop up to try to probably help the U.S. have some type of presence in battery recycling and battery circular economy solutions for the end of life of those solutions. Where do you find that that's a part of the conversation now too, when we start to think about mineral supply gaps and how we're addressing that at a national priority? And we don't, I'm not going to mention a brand, but for the largest corporates in the US that are thinking about their own electric fleets, how does a company think about that and their impact in sort of helping guide that national policy from a mineral gap perspective?
Yeah, that's another really great question, and a major aspect that comes up in these discussions of critical mineral supply chains, right? And um, I think the two terms that I hear most common in these discussions on this topic are supply chain resilience and national security. And to focus, predominantly on the U.S., going from my time previously at the State Department and in the intelligence community as well, um, the uh, the national security importance of critical minerals, the minerals that go into our batteries, is absolutely vital, because they don't just go into electric vehicles; they go into defense industries as well. They go, the magnets and everything that perpetuates, unfortunately, these like weapons of war and what have you, or even satellites and communications, our cell phones. All these types of things are reliant very heavily on critical minerals, and a lot of that processing today, as we all know, is done in China. And let alone that there's a massive emissions associated with sending minerals from all around the world to one country over here, and then sending those back to the U.S. And then in some instances, if it's at end of life, whatever the material might be, then it's sent back to China, and then maybe back to the U.S., the EU, whatever it might be. And that's the economic system we operate in today. It's Ricardian economics in short, right? But that's there's some, we know there's U.S. China trade war that's still kind of ongoing with an incoming administration too, and the potential of tariffs. We already saw, I think, 2 weeks ago, China saying that they're going to stop exports of certain critical minerals and heavy metals to the U.S. that are vital for things like batteries and defense industry and communications. And this is similar to things that we had seen in the past between, for example, China and Japan, and restrictions on exports of certain minerals to Japan, obviously a country that does a lot in the high tech industry. because of a dispute at some islands that both countries claim ownership over. Two fishing vessels or whatever it was that crashed into each other, and that resulted in restriction of the exports of those minerals. So I think the onshoring is really important, and the onshoring is also critical for supply chains. However, I'd say if you want supply chain resilience, what is better than using your own material you already have, right? We're importing. I'm speaking for the U.S. Exclusively here right now, but like we're importing this battery material, hyper valuable, and then when they get to end of life, we may be sending them out, unfortunately, to places like to Africa to be processed and in environmentally questionable ways. My thought is this is really valuable material. Would we send gold and all all these other valuable materials elsewhere? We know what's in our batteries today. Let's take that material out. Let's reuse it back into our own supply chains today. It's incredibly valuable material.
And unfortunately, we are sending gold and other valuable materials out in the form of e-waste. So it is already being sent out. Yeah, you're exactly right. Sabira, you locked and loaded on you got something.
Yeah, well, so it's I mean, like you're referencing kind of like systemic resistance or just ways of working that are constraining or like wild goose chase of material flows around the world. I'm also curious if there is industry resistance. Like you have the EV kind of like wave that is growing and then maybe subsiding, and what other kind of factors are limiting the adoption of EVs in general, and then what that means for batteries or the battery industry specifically.
And I hate to tack on another one in there. Sabir, great question of where do the headlines play into this? Because we hear a lot about this. I'd be curious how you blend that in.
Absolutely. So you guys are asking all the right questions here. So from industry perspective, again, purely speaking on my own personal perspective here, not representing any company or what have you, the data don't match what the headlines are saying. When, yes, there was a little bit of a drop in demand for EVs, but it's kind of picked back up. And we have to look at that in 2020, worldwide, there were 3 million new EVs registered. In 2024, this year, this is a rough estimate, but it's going to be somewhere around this number by the end of the year, the next couple of weeks. It's going to be 16.5 million. So that's a 5x increase between 2020 and 2024, right? So it's a massive drive. It's like exponentially increasing, and we're not really seeing such a growth like this for internal combustion engine vehicles, right? EVs are a trend that is here to stay. And headlines that are saying that EVs are going away, I think are a bit salacious. They don't match the data.
That gets to then the point too, Sabir, of your question is where's the market competition? Clearly there's friction somewhere in there where I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but the idea that there are articles being written to advance narratives is not too unfounded. Where do you find that? Do you find that battery manufacturing, those that are making new, don't want to be competing with the idea of used? Do you find that this is oil and gas potentially, in your opinion? I mean, where does this sort of start, and where's the friction here for such an innovation and such a beneficial potential adoption for us nationally?
It's a great question. I don't have a great answer to it though, other than to say that this is probably what, if both of you were asked this question, I imagine, or others would think, is that it's a host of a lot of factors. Right. And that's not the most exciting answer, but there's political considerations here. There's economic considerations. Change is hard. Right. And the economic transition that we're going through is really difficult. To move from a linear to a circular economy, ditto as well. There's going to be kind of initial winners and losers as we move from one industry to another. But should we hold ourselves back to progress in creating a more equitable and green economy and world? No. I mean, should we use today? For fear of impacting the horse and buggy industry? Should we continue to drive a horse and buggy today, or should we really, lean into the electric vehicles that we have and continue to develop that? No, I think it would be just as crazy to say that we ought to use those own industries to protect them. Let's go with the pace of development. Let's look at the technologies that we have today to really create that new economy. And excuse me. Um, One other thing that I'd like to note too, to an earlier question about circular economy, market, development and economic benefits. I'm a numbers guy, so I want to point this out as well. The global circular economy market was valued at about 338 billion in 2022 and is projected to grow at compound annual growth rate of about 10.8%, reaching 630 billion by 2027. And some estimates, I think it's by like Accenture or what have you, is by 2030, the circular economy could unlock multiple trillions of dollars of economic value. And so what we're talking about here is not just recycling or something along those lines. It's really rethinking systems and bringing more businesses and economic opportunities and people into a more holistic and equitable economic system.
We love that and hope for that. I'm curious if, kind of like going back to the beginning of the conversation when we talked about like the technology itself, like what futuristic tech innovations have you like seen on the horizon that is starting to kind of get you excited for the future?
Oh gosh, there's so much cool stuff happening out there these days. Um, I think the solid, the not the thermal batteries are really exciting to me. Just given that their potential of moving away from critical mineral material and using more readily available material is really exciting. Um,
Can you explain a thermal battery in lay terms?
Absolutely. So, in short, a thermal battery is, or maybe a better way to label it, is a heat battery. You are charging up these items that can hold heat really well, like a block made of clay or basically carbon, in a box, enclosed in a box. And when you need to access that energy, you can do something. This is a gross overgeneralization, but you can do something like open a slot that releases the steam or the heat that's trapped from these clay blocks, and that can turn like a generator of some regard. So again, gross generalization there, but a box where you're putting heat into with things that are can hold that heat and then releasing that heat when you want the energy.
Excellent. Yes. To that end, and those developments, where what's on the horizon line for policy? What's on the horizon line for the economic arguments of making some of these batteries even more possible for generations of cars or home use? Where do we find that sort of taking the next step that you're seeing of adoption?
I think on adoption, I think on adoption, I think the trend is already going to continue to go in the direction that it is. In similar type of thing, like we've seen solar and wind become much cheaper now than other energy sources that are more polluting. So I think that we'll continue to see things in adoption in this way. In the US, I am a little concerned about the potential repeal of the EV tax credit. I think it's about $7,500 today for a new EV. Then there's a certain amount for if you're getting a secondhand EV as well. I think it's like 2,500 or something like that. With the incoming administration saying that they're going to repeal that, electric vehicles today are a bit more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. But when you look at the overall life cycle use of them, electricity charging them is going to get cheaper and cheaper depending on your access to certain the grid and what have you, and how that grid's being powered. And I think gas and oil and gas are going to get probably more and more expensive in our lifetime because it's a finite resource. It's going to get harder and harder to access that and refine it. So your input to drive your vehicle is going to get more expensive, but also maintenance. Like EVs have less moving parts, and when fixing that, it's a lot easier to do something like that where you're kind of plug and play. Gross generalization there, but plug and play as compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle where you've got all these like tons of little bits and pieces that go into the vehicle. So that's my thoughts on adoption. On the collection side of things, which we haven't talked about so much yet, and just to again emphasize, why are we talking so much about EVs in the battery context? Again, because it's the majority of the drive of the increase for battery demand in the U.S. and really globally as well. Um, is the costs and the difficulties of aggregating end of life material. Now, for a company like Redwood Materials, you mentioned them earlier, but there's tons of other companies out there like Li-Cycle's another one in the U.S. They are reliant on their feedstock. That's how they make their money, right? And to collect enough, right?
Yes, let's
Right?
go.
You need
Yes.
economies of scale. You need enough material to allow you to keep these furnaces burning, to have the wheels of your facility continually going. And there's some headwinds to that today, right? There are EV batteries are lasting longer than we thought they might. We thought initially maybe like 7 years or something like that. I've heard ranges of 7 to 14 years, but some are going much longer. Some people don't mind. A EV battery has a distance, a range of a few dozen miles, right? If they're driving in a city, so that feedstock can kind of be down. So other estimates I've heard is that there's going to be a huge tsunami of an increase of like millions of end of life vehicle batteries hitting the market by about 2030, 2032 or so. So these companies are in a bit of a tough moment because they're waiting for that tsunami to hit, and it's a bit of a trickle right now. But it's hard to have a trickle when you're making, million square foot facilities that have to continually be collecting material. The second
The investment in a trickle is a tough argument sometimes.
immensely,
Yes.
immensely, right? Like, what's that
Yeah.
return on
Yeah. Yeah.
investment? And typically, return on investment, some investor firms is maybe 5 years, typically less than that. And do the math, right? We're in 2020, let's call it 2025 right now, and if we're looking at 2030, 2032, that return on investment's 5, 7 years out, right? And starting to hit it at levels that we'd want. The second point I'd say is there's not, well, let me put it this way. It is very hard to move end of life EV batteries around in this country. The packaging that you might need to put them in, and this is same for EU as well and other places too. The packaging can be quite expensive, especially if it's a damaged battery, like a battery that was in a front end collision and the airbag went off in the vehicle. Um, there's certain regulations where you need to move the battery around in like these steel boxes or whatever it might be. Those boxes can cost as much as the battery costs to manufacture. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars. And that's for one of these boxes to move them around. And then you get from one state to another state, and oh, wait, there's actually a different law for how to move the battery around in this state than that state. But the battery is from here, and the plant to manufacture or reuse it or whatever it might be is over here. There's not really so much of a harmonized law from here to there. So this is another area for policy to come in, and let's harmonize those laws. Let's standardize the packaging laws too, because they're kind of standardized right now, but if you've ever read them, at least to me, they're kind of confusing. And it's like you can use this whole long list of, a crate that's made out of wood or this one made out of metal, and it's like let's streamline that a little bit, and let's also, I think, not talk about batteries as hazardous waste. Let's talk about them as resources, which also can enable more easily moving this material between boundaries.
I didn't think that we were on this podcast going to really truly link reusable cups to reusable containers for batteries, and that there's problems they're very similar in each industry. Of again, ubiquity, trying to scale those solutions, trying to deal with the fact that you don't want a cup that's 3 times the price of the coffee that's in it, and how do you kind of continue to use that and not have it lost in the system, that's applicable to the steel box you might put a battery in. I love that. I want to round out something real quickly, just because it was fascinated me, and you mentioned it, that there are 20 parts used in an electric vehicle that might propel that vehicle, as opposed to 2,000 parts in a internal combustion engine. So a magnitude of difference. And then ultimately, what I loved about what you just said previously about the feedstock, and how difficult it is to properly invest in the solutions, when I've been particularly fascinated as of late with a concept called essentially seeding. I had never heard this concept until I read a couple academic papers that were essentially talking about products that are seeded in the market are the ones that have been ready for harvesting, but that were planted 20 years ago. And you need to figure out the solutions for those products because you can turn those products into something. The complication being significant innovation, where it's like, oh, maybe these are completely outdated and you can't reuse these. But that's not always the case. And there might be applicable uses for these products that have been out in the market for 10 years that are coming back and ready to be reused. But the idea of that being a seed is a fascinating concept to me that we can prepare for harvest.
I agree with you. And 2 points to back that up are that we talked a bit about thermal batteries. Thermal batteries are a technology that's like 100 plus years old. The use of electric vehicles was actually and chargers was more widespread than internal combustion engine vehicles back in the early 1900s, and then we moved to internal combustion engine vehicles instead, right? So we're kind of coming back to these other technologies that were planted long before, and we're developing them more rapidly to today's needs and standards too. So totally agree with you on that point. Yeah, it's a great point.
Well, to wrap this all up, Sabira, you want to lead us there?
I do want to lead us to, we normally ask, what are you hopeful for? And we'll ask specifically about batteries, but I also am curious if we didn't ask you something that you wanted to share here today.
I think that's very important in this technical aspect of this. Yes.
What should we know that we might not?
Great question to end on. And again, compliments, great questions throughout this entire session today. I would say tagline for me is something I said earlier in our discussion here is waste isn't just a failure of materials, it's a failure of imagination. And so as we're developing these new systems of how do we use materials efficiently, it's going to need creative thinking. It's going to need bringing in different perspectives from across the gamut. It's going to lead to an immense amount of opportunities. I mentioned this $1 trillion plus market of new opportunities for revenue generation for existing companies, new companies, for governments, and everybody in between. So I'm really excited about what we're going to see as we move from a linear to a circular economy, inevitably in our lifetimes, because not only is it necessary to really save the planet, I'm a firm believer that I think the circular economy is the means by which we tackle climate change. But it's also smart business too, right? There's great economic opportunities to be made with the circular economy. And in the US, we're starting to see companies realize that too, as companies in the EU have known for a while. And I would say too, a lot of places in Asia, I mean, look at Singapore, look at Taiwan, especially Taiwan's a heavyweight in the entire world for circular economy. It doesn't get enough, kudos for it as well, especially in electronics industry, and the textile industry. So some great stuff there. Putting a period on that particular point. Other things I would say to leave on. I mean, I think that we were quite extensive in what we discussed today. So I'm gonna, give me a moment to pause here, if I may, and I want to look through my notes if there was anything else that I wanted to make sure to mention, but...
Well, ultimately, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Gosh, I mean, frankly, having conversations like we're having here today, attending things like...
I'm so flattered.
Yeah, no, seriously. I mean, having conversations like this, having people listen to conversations like this, and having more of an interest is awesome. Attending Circularity last year and seeing, having one of the previously Greenbriz, now Trellis, one of the leaders from that org come up and say, just a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, there was a few hundred people in this room, 200-300. Now there's a few thousand people in this room for a circular economy focused exclusive conference, right? And so the interest is exploding. I sit on the planning committee for the Pacific Northwest Climate Week, and we had a session last night to plan out what are the topics that we want to talk about at next year's Pacific Northwest Climate Week. Circular economy was, I would say, the the topic that most people were excited about, the most ideas for panels and sessions and all that were just flowing out from everybody across the room. And this is what excites me, is that circular economy from when I first started working in it like a decade ago to where it's at today in this country is just like it's a total shift. It's hot, it's sexy, it's focused on these days. And that gives me a lot of hope because there's so much promise in this, and to see more and more people and companies and private and the governments prioritizing it, it makes me really excited in the future that we're going to see truly becoming circular in our lifetimes.
Okay, so to a sexy circular economy
Oh yeah,
2025. That's where we're headed. Yes, could not agree
circular
more.
economy.
Um, excellent. Grayson, thank you for today. Thank you for all the insight, the notes, the technical analysis. It's been a joy. We look forward to having you back when we get to talk more batteries.
Absolutely, the pleasure is mine as well. Thank you for the great questions, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.